I'm going to be talking about unleashing the power of practical sensors. But first I just wanted to say a couple of things about Edge Impulse. One of them is that I'm a massive fan of what they've been doing to actually bring all of this Edge AI stuff into the world and make it boring, which I'm. The other thing I would like to say that is an incredibly massive good idea is having double-sided badges. So thank you for putting that together. So I'm actually going to be talking about what makes a sensor a sensor. Because we all sort of know what we're talking about when we talk about sensors, but what we've really been doing at Useful Sensors and before that at Google is trying to figure out how we can take this very complex world of machine learning and actually turn it into something that's really easy for people to pick up and just start using. And one of the ideas that has been most powerful for that has been this idea of, okay, let's actually package it up in a module. Engineers know how to use sensors in their systems. People are used to using all these different kinds of sensors and building systems around them. So let's actually see if we can package this very scary, complicated, new, hard to understand, undocumented black magic that is machine learning. And let's see if we can actually put it behind this abstraction of, okay, you've actually got a sensor that's telling you something you can use. And so I've ended up doing a lot of thinking about, okay, what even is a sensor? Where do these things come from? The first example of something that's kind of like a sensor that I could find in history is this idea of a nilometer, which I sort of love the name because it almost tells you what it does. This is essentially a ruler carved in stone, placed in somewhere where the Nile floods. And there's a whole bunch of these. I think this one is actually in a well. And these were first put together thousands of years ago by the Egyptians to help them understand and measure what was happening with the Nile when it flooded. Because every year, up until the dam was put in the 60s anyway, for every year the Nile would flood, and that was super important for the agriculture of Egypt, because that's what actually refreshed the soil, put water into the soil, gave you stores of water, and so it was crucial for determining whether you'd actually have a good harvest or a bad harvest. And to understand why this is such a big leap, because you might look at this and think, oh, that's kind of obvious. But if you can imagine the alternative to having these dotted around the place was a bunch of people actually kind of looking at the Nile and saying, okay, I think that's that's kind of a medium-high flood, so we're going to have a pretty good harvest, and you'd have a whole bunch of people kind of making this very subjective judgment. What this allowed was giving you an objective measure that you could actually compare over time. So even beyond the lifetime of the people who are looking at this, you can actually say, okay, this is better than the flood we had 50 years ago, and that actually resulted in this outcome. So it really gave a whole new way of making decisions. And this is why I'm kind of including this as kind of the first glimmerings of a sensor, was because this was, and this network of these, they were tied in to this whole system of government. So you have this measuring device that's actually helping people make decisions, giving them actionable insights, helping them plan for the year ahead on matters of life and death. But the key thing that I want to kind of take away from this is you're getting a single value. So you've taken this very vague sort of, hey, how good do you think the flood is this year? And this boils it down into a mark on a pillar, a mark on a wall, which you can then use to compare against history, and you've just got that one mark. So it's something that's a lot easier to work with than the alternative of having people just kind of say, hey, I think this is kind of a decent flood, or whatever it is like that. So really thinking about sensors, one of the key things that they offer is this very thin interface. They take a very complex system and they say, this is the one or two or three things that you actually need to care about from the point of view of making decisions and feeding in to the rest of the system. So I want to jump forward a few thousand years to around the time of Galileo, and actually jumping back to the the ancient Greeks as well, because there was a lot of confusion and debate about temperature, and this is one of the archetypal things that we think of when we talk about sensors now. Is you've got a temperature sensor. It's obvious. You just get a number, and you just don't even really think about it. But like Galen back in ancient Greece, when he talked about temperature, they even actually had some devices that could do very basic measurements of temperature. But when he talked about degrees of temperature, he had 4 degrees. And they were basically, really hot, somewhat hot, not hot at all, and cold. And as you can imagine, that's not a very useful scale to use. It's coming back to the idea of people having subjective measurements, people just kind of, saying what they're feeling. And even like fast forwarding, into the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, when, Galileo was starting to do a much more systematic approach to this stuff. There was actually a lot of resistance around the idea of being able to encapsulate temperature as a single number, because people were like, hey, you're saying that, I'm feeling sun on my arm, and that's the same heat as me getting into a warm bath. Like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, this abstraction is taking away too much information. It's kind of destroying the poetry of the world, but it's also, it's missing out on all of these important aspects of the system. And they weren't entirely wrong, because if we think about weather forecasts, thankfully this doesn't happen too much in California, but if you grew up somewhere like the UK or out on the East Coast, you'll know in winter you'll get temperatures, but then they'll say, but with wind chill, it's going to feel like X. So even though it sounds a bit silly to us to say, oh, temperature is much too complex a phenomenon to capture as a single number, because we know from all of our schooling that it can be, it's a big conceptual leap. It's not something that actually came natural. It took a long time. It took hundreds of years of work and experiment to really get to the point where we could have these objective scales that everybody agreed on. So a big part of what we're trying to do when we talk about sensors and when we turn things into sensors is this idea of trying to abstract away all of the details of what's happening under the hood. And there's a whole bunch of parts of that. Part of it is this idea of really trying to have this very, very simple interface. So you're able to get exact values out in a very simple way and understand how to use them. But a big part of it, too, is trying to come up with measurements and standardization that means that you can swap out different implementations under the hood without you actually having to really worry that you're going to have to rework your entire system. If you replace a temperature sensor, you kind of expect that it's still going to work pretty much the same, and you don't have to really worry about what the implementation is. The reason that I'm spending so much time focusing on these two properties in particular is that machine learning is not like that at the moment. We often are exposing quite complex sets of information because the models expose them. We just kind of get whatever we get out of the models, and then we have to do a whole bunch of post-processing to boil down what's often very raw, kind of a soup of information into something that's actually actionable, and that's what we need. And what we get out of those models is often very dependent and very implementation dependent on the model themselves. So I'm going to come back to these, but to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, think about the classic example of ImageNet, where you get these numbers in an array out of the model. And the first impulse of most people when they're learning machine learning is like, awesome, okay, I've got probabilities. This is 63% likely that this is a penguin. And once you dive in deeper, you actually realize that these are very arbitrary scores. And as you change the training data, without even changing the model, if you retrain with different training data, you'll get different scores for the exact same image that you put in. And let alone you change the model architecture itself. So you really start to get into this world where every time that you make a change to the model, the rest of the system actually has to be changed to deal with this. And there's a great paper, the high interest debt of machine learning. I think I'm messing up the title somewhat, but that talks about how building systems around machine learning models is really hard because of the ripple impact they have on everything else. So this is where we really need that moment or that process of standardizing what the outputs from not just our models, but from these ML modules that we have are, so that people are actually able to swap in different just software systems even, not talking about just hardware here, but even just different software systems without having to rework the entire rest of the whole system that it's going into. And coming back to this example, at a certain large search company, which I won't name, doing web image search, this was such a problem because the models were constantly changing, but you really wanted to be able to have the results be stable over time. There was actually a massive amount of work on calibration curves was one way to handle this, where you would actually take the raw outputs of the new models and then run them through a whole bunch of kind of fairly complex processes and statistical analysis and things to figure out how to get scores that were generally stable and related back to the previous models that you had been using before. And this isn't really a well-known process, but what I've seen is as companies get beyond just deploying their first model, this suddenly starts to become a massive issue. So I want to just talk a little bit as well about Daniel Gabriel Fahrenheit, because it turns out that this is not a new problem. Coming back to this idea of temperature, he gave his name to the scale because he did a lot of the work that actually helped us figure out how to have, 0 degrees Fahrenheit at this point and 100 degrees Fahrenheit at this point. And it was something that people have been wrestling with for decades. And partly I just wanted to talk about him because he's kind of really cool. His parents died when he was young by eating poisonous mushrooms, so he was apprenticed off to this merchant's firm in another country in Europe, in Amsterdam, and he hated it. So he stole money from his employers and decided to become a freelance fugitive chemist, running around Europe trying to escape the arrest warrant that was out for him after he did this. And he was so successful, he actually became a Fellow of the Royal Society and was recognized for his work. But he was such a wild man, he actually ended up dying in poverty in the end. But if you ever look at his biography, it feels like he had a lot of fun. And I almost feel like there's like a Breaking Bad sort of Enlightenment version of a TV series that could be made about him. But the point of this is really that there's a whole bunch of work that we as a community need to do around getting beyond the first deployment and helping people actually pick up the things that we're doing, these modules, and use them as interchangeable parts and be able to not have to do a whole bunch of custom work every time they want to use something that we're putting together. And I've been really pleased to see the role that Edge Impulse has been taking in this stuff. I will actually just jump back to give a quick plug to some of the hardware sensors that we're actually trying to build as well, so that they can really be things that electrical engineers just pick up off the shelf. Things like, hey, is there a person here or not? And I will be demonstrating later in the hall if you come and grab me, doing the speech-to-text that we're actually doing. But what's really tying all of this together is this idea that we want to be able to build better abstractions for people, help people stop worrying about what's happening under the hood, make this stuff boring, as Zach has been pushing. And so I really think if we look back through history and look at the way that all of these other things have evolved, we'll be able to do a much better job for the people who are going to be using this stuff. So that's my little foray into history. I hope it was interesting, and I look forward to chatting with lots of you at the break.